Hello and welcome to the Pod Like a Pro podcast.
This is a podcast that shares tips, tricks and personal experiences so you can podcast like the professionals.
I'm Nat.
And I'm Liz.
And we're from Pod and Pen Productions.
We would like to pay respect to the storytelling traditions of the Awabakal people whose land we are recording this episode on.
We're recording this episode to come out on Boxing Day, and a thing people like to really do around Christmas and Boxing Day, and I'm sure you might like to do it too, is hang out and share time with other people.
It made us think, Nat, didn't it, that although podcasts are usually a solo experience and we think about it as that solo experience and you're having your earbuds in your ears, have you ever thought what it would be like for people to listen to your podcast together?
We were interested to find out from the PodPoll 24 survey from Deadset Studios that 57% of podcast listeners are eager for co-listener experiences of content that everyone likes.
That's so interesting. So how do you create or tweak your content for a shared experience? Be it for if people are listening in that lounge room or the car. And I suppose we don't really ever know how people are listening unless we ask them. But it's an interesting idea to think about what your podcast would be like if it was listened in that shared experience.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be sharing people sitting next to each other like people used to sit around the radio in the good old days. It could be people who are listening on their own and sharing their experiences and thoughts a little bit later, like they used to do in the early 2000s around the water cooler. If you're old enough to remember what that is.
And if you watched it, because people used to watch TV shows at the same time, shock horror, and then we would all talk about it the next day, this big episode that was coming out where, somebody got married or somebody died or whatever it was, and everybody was like, oh, did you watch that? Do you remember Molly dying in A Country Practice?
Oh, yes, I do remember Molly dying. And I even remember sort of around the same time, my mother was really, really interested in Who Shot JR.
Oh, yes. See, so it was this collective experience. And podcasts can actually have that as well.
So I think it's really handy to have in the back of your mind that people are having these shared experiences, and that's helpful for you because you're not completely making your podcast any differently to what you're doing. You've still got the same premise, you've still got the same ideal audience. You're just thinking of ways in which you can help it be a little bit more of a shared experience, thinking about those things that might open up a bit of discussion amongst your listeners and encourage your listeners to listen at the same time as well, because they know that it's going to be content where there is that room for discussion, for how they feel about stuff. And it's really about that feeling. It's really about tapping into how someone feels about something, because that's what people are going to discuss.
Yeah, I really like that. It's, some of those tips, the practical tips, I suppose, to be able to get into that feeling would be to talk about asking your listeners questions about how they're feeling. I suppose would that be something that you would think would work, like a view or a perspective, even something that could be a little bit controversial but not too controversial, something that's a bit fun controversial, like the jam or cream goes first on a scone sort of question. That works well.
Yeah, I think it's really thinking about, and we know this from working in live radio with talkback and talkback questions and talkable topics, is having content or elements of your content that fits into what you're doing, that it doesn't sort of stray off the track just to serve this purpose, but bits of your content that are going to be received differently by different people. So I always like to think about those things that people know for sure themselves. They know for sure themselves that the cups should go into the cupboard, rim down. But you've got somebody else who goes,
no, they shouldn't.
No, you shouldn't, because, rim down because the dust can't fall into the cup. Yeah. And you don't have to wash it out before you're not drinking dust. But then the other person would say, but there's germs on the cupboard shelf.
That's
so of course the cups go face up.
Face up.
So you've got these very definite opinions. And
I love that they're definite opinions, but the stakes are not all that high. We're not talking about politics. We're not talking about religion. We're not talking about, freedom of speech, where things can get really heated and quite emotional and nasty. We're talking about cups. I remember one time being in live radio, one of the biggest talk back, fiery discussions that we had was over which version of Hallelujah was best. And it all happened organically. We played a version of Hallelujah. The presenter on the day said, gee, that is the best version. And I said, it absolutely is not the best version. And from there, we had hundreds of people calling in, telling us which version was the best version of Hallelujah. Again, it was stakes are not high, but people have strong feelings.
Stuff that's subjective, stuff that's sort of not wrong or right, but people have a really strong feeling about. So you're looking at topics and issues that people have differing opinions on or have different perspectives on. And so the way that might work in your podcast is you might be talking about a topic with a guest, but you may know that your listeners, your ideal audience, they may have differing perspectives on what your guest is talking about. And so you're speaking to your guest and you're being respectful for them to get their perspective, but you would maybe benefit from putting another perspective across and saying, maybe have you considered this perspective, and why is this perspective not your perspective? And then you can ask your audience, how do you feel about this? So it's really not being afraid when the topic becomes more like an onion, as we used to say in the radio game. And what I mean by an onion is you start peeling the onion and it reveals another layer, and another layer, another layer. So with perspectives and opinions, it's not being afraid of unfolding all of those layers, because not everyone has the same opinion. Not everybody has the same view. And I think, Liz, when you were mentioning about Molly dying, a country practice being a television show, if you're explaining something or you've got a guest who's explaining something, you might want to introduce a scenario from a well-known sitcom or relate, this to a character from a movie. And who's more widely known. And that's a great example too, because, you could talk about someone like Bridget Jones. And I was listening to a podcast quite recently, which is a psychology podcast that was talking about Bridget Jones and Bridget Jones's personality and applying that to psychological things.
And I like that, because you're sort of going back to that feelings that you were talking about before. It's evoking a feeling, and it's a shared experience feeling, because everybody knows that. I mean, it's Boxing Day when this is coming out, and we can all talk about Love Actually, and when
we? Isn't it problematic?
The Keira Knightley character and oh, definitely. I was thinking more about the Emma Thompson character when she finds out she's being cheated on, and we all, everybody collectively feels that, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a shared experience that anyone can draw on by talking about it. I mean, we're doing that right now, aren't we? What about the role of humour when we're talking about people listening to things together or sharing what happened in something? How important is humour?
Well, I think humour is really important, because I think that podcasts that have a high level of humour, like My Dad Wrote a Porno, is a podcast that I actually did listen to with somebody else. Because there was definite scope for that shared experience, because it feels better when you're laughing along with somebody else.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you could be on the train or the bus or even in the car and you're but it's a special moment, isn't it, when you laugh with somebody else?
Absolutely. And that also makes me think about kids podcasts as well, because, I've got 3 kids and we do listen to some podcasts in the car sometimes, especially when we're driving. So it sort of helps to break up the music or the monotony, and we put on something that's quite funny, but kid, made for kids. And there's some really funny kids podcasts out there. There's one called Mr. Snotbottom, I think he is. And, and of course they love that. They love all that sort of stuff. And there's some really good educational ones as well. Hey History is a fantastic kids podcast as well. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of them out there. And I think that, that offers a really beautiful shared experience for kids and kids' imaginations, and a shared family experience where everybody's imaginations can run wild with the stories. And so Nat, what about, I'm thinking about if you are actually trying to make something that's a bit more of a shared experience, is there ways to tell people about it outside just your podcast?
Social media is really good. If you can put some questions in your social media that have the power to find differing opinions and perspectives, that's really good. You get people talking in that space as well, and making sure that they're related to the content that you're doing as well. You can even use that to feed back in to your podcast. You can say on Facebook, we asked this question, or Instagram, we asked this question. You might remember last week we were talking about this topic, and this is what people said. Because it brings those conversations from the lounge room, from the car, from the water cooler, or where people fill up their designer water bottles these days. It brings that energy back into the podcast and really shows people that these are things that start conversations and that they can have conversations about as well. And another thing that you can do is you can give clues about the next topic or the next guest. For the next episode, and then you've got people talking amongst each other about what it could be. I mean, make sure that they're interesting enough and not too obvious. I mean, if you've got somebody famous coming up on your next episode, I would just say that they're coming up. But can you guess what we're talking about?
Or have you got a question you've ever wanted to ask this person?
Yeah, getting questions from the audience is a really great thing as well, because not only are people having a shared experience with each other who are listening together or talking about it later, but they're also having that shared experience with you.
I really like that, because there's so many aspects there of bringing things together and sharing them together. And I suppose in any podcast, in any way that we do that, we can still have that, because it's creating a community, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. And that real sense of community is a really important thing when you're thinking about shared listening experiences, when you're thinking about co-listeners. A sense of community goes back to the authenticity that people are looking for.
So I guess ultimately you can't tell if your podcast is being listened to by one person or by many, but if you stick to those basics that we do talk about a lot, using you-based language, keeping it interesting but also snappy, don't be overindulgent about what happened to you on the weekend, that sort of thing, you're guaranteed to maintain your audience no matter how many people are listening at once.
And if you want to find out more about how we can help you make your podcast, go to podandpen.com.au.
Where you can also find out about our online Pod Like a Pro course. We're getting very excited to open the doors to that course again in February next year.
And as we mentioned, we're recording this episode in December, and that Christmas present is still waiting for you.
Da, 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 da.
It's how to start a podcast checklist. And you can find that at podandpen.com.au as well. And we'll also link it to our show notes.
And until next time, happy listening.